Chapter 2. And then I woke up, he told himself, and it had all been a dream. People are sometimes easily overlooked. The holes they leave behind when they aren't there anymore are far harder to miss. It made Paul think of science lessons at school. He'd never been able to get his head around concepts like negative numbers and antimatter, but now it made complete sense. Everywhere he looked, and even when he closed his eyes, all he could see was the absence of Sophie, the gap where she used to be, should have been, no longer was. It was so large, it dominated the landscape so much that he was pretty sure it must be visible from orbit, like the Great Wall of China or the lights of the San Francisco freeways. Maybe, he speculated, not that he gave a shit, that's what ghosts are. The huge empty spaces left behind when someone dies, kept wedged willfully open by the self-destructive human mind. Above all, for some crazy reason, Sophie's tangible absence put him in mind of the ridiculous portable door, except that it was a gap in nature that opened only into the past, and through which it would be extremely perilous to go. Paul made himself a strong cup of tea, but it really didn't help much. He considered going to the pub on the corner and drinking himself into a spongy mess, but he had to go to work tomorrow and learn how to fight stupid dragons. Just on the off chance, he tried magic, but he gave himself a headache concentrating very hard, and when he opened his eyes, Sophie still wasn't there. That figured. Magic only repairs that which has got screwed up. In this case, apparently, the mistake had already been rectified. There wasn't anything on the telly apart from game shows and snooker, and he wasn't in the mood. He tried going to bed, but the hole next to him was so wide and deep that he was afraid he'd roll into it and never climb out. So he sat in the armchair. He'd have read a book, but all the books on the shelf were hers. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Paul came to the conclusion that he didn't like himself very much, which was a pity, since he was stuck with him, forsaking all others. At 7 o'clock he got dressed, shaved, combed his hair. There wasn't any bread, and the milk wasn't entirely liquid. Magic would have set it right, but he couldn't be bothered. He went to work. The receptionist smiled at Paul as he went past the front desk, which showed how much she knew about anything. He really didn't want to go to his office, because there'd be a hole on the other side of the desk he didn't particularly want to meet. Fuck Ricky Wormtoter, he thought. Just when I could use a portable door, he's got it. But he went and sat opposite the hole for a few minutes, until suddenly he remembered he was supposed to report to Benny Shumway first thing to begin his heroism lessons. Sorry, he started to say as he opened Mr. Shumway's door, but the office was empty. He stood on the threshold, frowning. He'd been at J.W. long enough to know that the cashier's absence— damn it, he thought, is nobody here anymore? Pretty soon I'll have the whole place to myself— could mean many things. It could be an intelligence test, the first step in his training, or maybe, 20 years ago, Mr. Shumway had sold his soul to the evil one and the bailiffs had just been round to collect him. Or maybe he'd just nipped across the landing for a quick pee. For once so, not knowing what was going on didn't bother him particularly. One of the advantages of nothing mattering anymore is that nothing matters. Paul sat down and stared out of the window. Some trick of the light meant that he saw his own reflection rather than the buildings opposite. He didn't like looking at that. Depressing. Great, said a voice behind him. You're finally here. I've been all over the place looking for you. Mr. Shumway didn't sound happy, but that was hardly unusual. Paul noticed that in addition to his customary shabby charcoal grey suit, he had a pair of safety goggles pushed up onto his forehead and a pair of scorched leather gloves. He took these off and stashed them in a desk drawer. Right, he went on, since we're late starting, and since we've already met, we won't bother with the getting to know you crap. Beowulf! Paul wondered if that was dwarvish for a tissue. Sorry? Beowulf, Mr. Shumway repeated. Fine, you've never heard of it. He opened another drawer, picked out a dog-eared paperback, and tossed it at Paul. Much to Paul's surprise, he caught it. Read it carefully. It's got a lot of useful stuff. For your information, it's an Anglo-Saxon epic poem about a guy who fights monsters. I'm assuming you've already read sections 5, 9 and 46 of the Office Procedures Manual. Normally Paul would have lied, but nothing mattered anymore, so why not tell the truth? Sorry, no, he said. I... Bloody hell. Mr. Shumway clicked his tongue. "Look," he said, "I know this is all an unwarranted intrusion on your free time, and you don't want to be here, but I've got work to do. I'm a realist, so I don't expect you to help, but I do expect you to try as hard as you can not to be a bloody nuisance. Do as you're told, do your homework, and don't waste any time. Understood?" Sorry," Paul replied, as guilt welled up inside him like the contents of a backed-up toilet. It's just that... Suddenly, alarmingly, Mr. Shumway grinned. "I know," he said. "Makes you feel a bit like you've just been kicked in the nuts. I remember one time I got told to get lost by the love of my life. I went straight out, got completely blasted, woke up in hospital. Got discharged a week later, married the nurse. 5th wife, nice kid, with a nose like a parsnip. Don't worry about it," he said cheerfully. "You're probably better off. Great thing about getting dumped is, it means you're now at liberty to go back to the sweet shop and try a few new flavours. It's only boring people and doves that mate for life. Have you ever seen a cheerful dove? Anyway," he said, moving a pencil so that it lay exactly parallel with the edge of the desk, "that's enough about that. No point you hang about here if you haven't done the background reading. I suggest you piss off somewhere quiet and read those chapters in the manual. And when you've done that, come back and we can get started." He hesitated, sneezed like a cannon shot, and wiped his nose on a huge red and white handkerchief. "Right?" "Right," Paul replied, slightly dazed. "Fine. That means you can leave the room. Goodbye." Paul was through the door and halfway to the stairs when he heard Mr. Shumway's voice behind him, calling out, "Remember Beowulf. Get it read." When he looked around, he saw Mr. Shumway's door closing. So, Paul thought as he trailed back down the stairs, everybody in the office seems to know. Probably knew before I did. Not a problem. Saves me having to do the embarrassing explanations. Probably better off, Shumway had said. Was there a current Mrs. Shumway? Paul hadn't heard about her if there was, but that didn't mean a great deal. No framed picture on the desk for what it was worth. He went back to his office and took the procedures manual down off the shelf, feeling his tendons creak as they took up the strain. As he did so, it occurred to him that Mr. Shumway hadn't said go back to your office and read the chapters. He'd just said somewhere quiet. Possibly just a sloppy choice of words, but perhaps it was compassion. Maybe Mr. Shumway had shared confined spaces with people who weren't there and understood. Well, it was an interpretation, and Paul could read a fat, dull book just as easily somewhere else as here. He couldn't quite bring himself to leave the building, but during the course of his wanderings he'd noticed a small room on the 5th floor that nobody seemed to use for anything. It had been empty except for a plain, old-fashioned wooden desk and a chair, just right for hiding in, assuming, of course, that it was still there. It was, although the desk and chair now had been joined by a ratty old green steel filing cabinet and 4 ancient-looking VDUs. He sat down, pulled out a drawer of the filing cabinet to rest his feet on, and opened the office procedures manual. There are some books you just can't manage to read, no matter how hard you try. Your eye skids off the page like a file of hardened steel, and 20 minutes later you'll find you read the same paragraph half a dozen times and still can't make head nor tail of it. Paul sighed, dumped the manual on the table, which shook like a jelly under its bulk, and fished Mr. Shumway's paperback out of his side pocket. Beowulf was slightly easier going, though there wasn't a great deal in it. Still, the pages were smaller, and there was fewer words on each one, and at least there wasn't a love interest. Paul couldn't help feeling a little concerned at the fact that he'd been given it to read as coursework. The actual monster-fighting stuff was a bit vague, and seemed to assume previous knowledge of swordsmanship and the like. Also, the hero who fought the dragon ended up dead, which didn't inspire confidence. Maybe that was the point, and he'd been given it to read so that he'd know how not to set about fighting dragons. No point trying to second-guess the syllabus. He ploughed on until he reached the end, by which time it was 5-1. Lunch. For some reason, it seemed extremely important that he should leave the building for a while. He put the book back in his pocket, left the manual where it was, and headed for the front office. The receptionist smiled at Paul again as he walked past. Odd, he reflected as he walked out onto the street, because he was fairly sure that she wasn't Mr. Tanner's mom, who leered rather than smiled. He could recognise her through any of her disguises at 25 yards. Another odd thing was that she hadn't been all that pretty. Invariably, the girls behind the reception desk, a different one each day, were always stunningly gorgeous, for the simple reason they were either Mr. Tanner's mum or one of his aunts, both of whom were human-shaped the way film stars wear claws, nothing but the best, and never the same outfit twice. The girl who'd smiled at him, however, had been pleasant-looking, but nothing more, and there hadn't been all the better to eat you with shine on her teeth that Paul had come to recognise as the hallmark of goblinesses in mufti. A genuine human being on reception? What was the old firm coming to? As to whether he was going to spend his precious 55 minutes of liberty, he had no idea. The Italian sandwich bar was out, obviously. Also the pub on the corner, which we crammed to the doors with gaps where Sophie wasn't. That just left the Starbucks at the end of the road, a grim, joyless place that reminded him of an airport late at night. But it was better than walking the streets. He bought a cup of coffee and a Danish pastry, and sat down at the only empty table. "Mind if I join you?" He looked up, and for the third time that day found himself looking down the barrel of the same unprovoked smile. "Please," he muttered. "Help yourself." She'd sat down next to him, carefully settling her own cup of coffee and Danish pastry on the wobbly tabletop. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said. Well, yes, Paul thought. Of course I do. You're the new receptionist. I saw you about 3 minutes ago. He said. "I'm Melts," she said. "De Mel's a Horrocks, Laburnham Grove Primary School." Her grin was entirely human, not a pointed tooth in sight. "You promised to marry me when we were both grown up, but I guess it must have slipped your mind." "Oh," Paul must have looked as startled as he felt, because she laughed. He couldn't understand. Why would anybody lie about a thing like that? Clearly she wasn't Melts, because she had freckles and 4 missing front teeth and a nose like a small doorknob, and she'd only been about 4 feet tall, but Paul suddenly realised she wasn't lying after all. She was still there, in the triangle between the eyebrows and chin, like the listed building surrounded by modern developments. In this case, gentrification. "You've changed," he heard himself say. "Thank you," she replied. "So have you. What are you doing in a dump like that?" "It was the only job I could get," he replied sheepishly. "Same here." Bloody hell, he was thinking. De Mel's a Horrocks. "That can't be right," he said. "At school you were the clever one. You got into whiffins and everything. I thought everybody who went there ended up as doctors or accountants." She smiled. "Not quite," she said. "I was headed in that direction, sure, but I never actually arrived. Dropped out of uni in my 2nd year. Boy trouble. Did bar work for a couple of years until I suddenly realised you can't be 19 forever and ever, and by then, apparently I was too incredibly ancient to be any use to anybody. So I learned typing and stuff, and here I am," she shrugged. "Wasted opportunities and all that. I could have been a chimney sweep if only I'd got the right A-levels." Paul didn't understand that, so he assumed it must be a quotation or something. "That's a pity," he said. I guess," he added. "Unless you're amazingly happy and well-adjusted and so on." She grinned. "No," she said. Oh, something occurred to him. Mel's," he said awkwardly. "You do know about J.W., don't you? Only—" She laughed. "About what they do? Yes, of course I know. First they told me at the interview. Pretty weird, but like they said, that aspect of things won't affect me really. All I'll be doing is answering the phone and normal boring stuff like that." Paul frowned. They hadn't told him anything of the sort at his interview. It'd taken him several weeks and an armed confrontation with a dozen red-eyed goblins before he found out. "It's not so bad," he said, on the principle that she probably wanted to hear something upbeat. "So long as you're out of the door by 5:30, that is. That's when—" "I know," she said. "They told me. Also, don't leave personal property in the desk drawers unless you want it shredded by 4-inch claws. You should see the 2nd floor ladies' loo, by the way. I guess the partners never think to go in there when they're making good the damage on a Monday morning." That reminded Paul of something else. "Did they happen to mention," he asked as casually as he could manage, about as casual as the Buckingham Palace sentry, unfortunately, "why they needed a receptionist? Only, up until now, a couple of the goblins—" "Mr. Tanner's mother, yes. Haven't you heard? She's pregnant, apparently, and goblins are rather old-fashioned about maternity leave and stuff." "Bloody hell!" One good thing, no, two, no, make that three. First, the joyful thought of how Mr. Tanner was going to react when presented with a baby brother or sister. Second, if Mr. Tanner's mum was going to be out of circulation for a while, he'd be able to get out the habit of scanning every attractive female he passed on the street for signs of twinkling eyes and feral grins. Third, fourth and fifth, Mel's was going to be there every day from now on, and he'd always liked Mel's a lot. Oh shit, he thought, not again. She was eating her Danish pastry. She'd been a mess eater when she was 9, and she hadn't changed. Bits of pastry shrapnel were spattered around her nose, chin and mouth. He caught himself noticing her mouth and quickly looked away. That was very bad, because, up till now, Mel's was the only female of approximately his own age with whom he'd ever felt comfortable. When they'd been kids together, they'd got into trouble splashing about in her dad's stagnant, leaf-clogged goldfish pond, hunting mosquito larvae with a butterfly net. They'd mangled balsa wood aircraft and tangled kite strings in shrubs together, fought over alleged rule infringements in marathon Monopoly tournaments, broken each other's toys. They'd been friends, even though she was technically a girl. It'd been like E.T. and all those other movies where a human and an alien forge bonds of friendship across the species divide. And now she'd betrayed all that, he couldn't help feeling, because she'd metamorphosed into a beautiful, or at least pleasant-looking, or at least not hideously deformed young woman. One of those dangerous creatures who break your heart and leave you notes and go away, filling the world with black holes. Quite. Mel's was still chattering happily away, apparently oblivious of her own foul treachery. You must know, is it true that goblins can make themselves look just like people? That could be, well, awkward, I suppose. Very, Paul heard himself say, especially since you can't trust them any further than you could sneeze them out of a blocked nostril. Have you come across them yet? Hardly, she smiled again, but this time he was ready for her and looked away. It's only my first day, remember? I've met all the partners, though. That Ricky Wormtoter, he's a specimen, isn't he? Paul wasn't quite sure what she meant by that, but caught himself feeling suddenly and furiously jealous, just in case it signified lust. He's gone off on some job, he said quickly. Won't be back for ages. In fact, I'm filling in for him till he gets back. Really? Mel's was looking at him with her oncoming lorry headlight eyes. But he does all the dragon slaying and vampire hunting and stuff, doesn't he? That's right. Cool. He was still looking away, but he could feel the smile. He could probably have toasted muffins over it. And that's what you do, is it? Yes, Paul squeaked. Well, some of the time. I help out with a lot of different stuff, actually, while I'm making up my mind which field I want to specialise in. You know. Amazing. But this is wrong, yelled a little voice inside his head. This time yesterday you were in love with Sophie for ever and ever. In fact, how do the time zones work? Is California 8 hours behind or 8 hours in front? Quite possibly, where Sophie was right now, it's probably still yesterday. And already, here he was, Paul Carpenter, loves lemming, adding to his already impressive collection of frequent faller points. The rebound is one thing, but the human heart shouldn't be a pinball machine. Wrong. Well, his voice said, ignoring all that, it's just a job, really. Better than digging peat or stacking shelves. I'd have jacked it in long ago, only... Yet another nasty thought struck him. Mel's, he said, have they made you sign a contract or anything? Only there's this clause. She shook her head. They told me about that, she said. It's just for the professional staff. General help like me. We can come and go as we please. I suppose they reckon we can't give away trade secrets to rival firms because we don't know any, and if we tried to blow the whistle on them for being wizards and all, or sell the story to the tabloids, nobody'd believe us because we're just silly girls. She shrugged. Which is fine, she said. Actually, I think I'll stick around for a while. I mean, it's weird, yes, but it's a bloody sight better than the dump I was at before. 1 10-minute coffee break and the staff room had cockroaches. That's, Paul bit off the rest of the sentence. He'd been about to say, that's wonderful, I'm so glad you're going to be working here. But why not? After all, she was his oldest friend. That's disgusting, he said. What's the coffee room like, by the way? I've never dared go in there. Haven't you? Why not? Is there a manticore in the cupboard under the sink or something? Worse than that, it's always full of girls. All the manticore can do is eat you. I don't think so, he said. But you never know around here. I mean, one of the staplers in the front office turned out to be the senior partner. Mel's giggled. "I heard about that," she said, and then, a slight change of tone of voice, "Wasn't it you who rescued him?" "Yes, me and..." Pause. "Me and one of the other clerks. She's not here anymore, though. Got posted to the Hollywood office." Paul had done his best to gloss over the obtrusive pronoun, but Mel's was onto it like a ferret on a lame rat. She didn't say anything, but the focus of her eyes changed a little. "And how about you, then?" she said. "Anyone special?" And that, Paul couldn't help thinking, was a bloody good question. "No," he said. "Not right now." He hoped she'd grown out of the knack of knowing when he was lying. "You?" She shook her head, and he made the point of not noticing the way her hair floated around her shoulders. "Not since the creep at uni, really. Before him, lots, all messy and horrid. Truth is," she went on, "I'm not particularly good at..." He could hear her open the inverted commas. "Relationships. Someone once said I fall in love like a young subaltern going over the top in 1914. A bit harsh, but basically true. I'm surprised you're still on the loose, though." Eek, Paul thought. That was a topic that ought to be sealed off by angels with flaming swords and Rottweilers. Time for a change of subject. "So, how's your family?" he asked. "Oh, fine," Mel's replied, with a trace of a sigh. "Just as normal and boring as ever. Dad's been made sales manager for the whole of the southeast, which is nice. Mum's still making soft toys for the Red Cross. What about your lot?" Paul grinned feebly. "Well, my parents emigrated to Florida last year," he said. "Sold the house, all the furniture and stuff. I get a phone call once or twice a month, 3 a.m. usually, because of the time difference. Mum tells me all about how she doesn't like the people next door, because their dog digs up the flower beds. I haven't told them about J.W. No point. They just think I was trying to be funny." Mel's clicked her tongue sympathetically. "They always were a bit, well, self-centred." "As a gyroscope," Paul replied. "I always liked your parents better than mine. At least yours always seemed pleased to see me." Mel shrugged. "And what about your uncle, the one who was away travelling in exotic places?" Paul had to think for a moment. "Uncle Ernie? I haven't heard from him in years. I assume he's still alive, or someone would have told me, but we lost touch ages ago." "It's a pity when that happens," Mel said. "I mean, there's times when it's a bit claustrophobic, having a close family like ours, but at least we can stay in touch." They chatted about families for a while, until he'd quite forgotten who he was talking to. And then, quite unexpectedly, it was 1:55, and there was only just enough time left to get back to the office. He left her at the front desk and wandered back to his room, thinking, all this and dragons too. Dragons, on the other hand, were probably something you could learn how to cope with, given time and patient tuition. After all that, it was hardly surprising that Paul found it extremely difficult to get his head round the office procedures manual that afternoon. At the best of times, he'd have had problems coming to terms with stuff like, "For a fully grown urban dragon, Draco vulgaris robinsoni, in a built-up area, the pest control, residential and commercial districts, regulations, 1964, Schedule 2, Paragraph 2, 1b, mandates the use of a tungsten or depleted uranium projectile of at least 0.577 diameter, not exceeding 800 grains avoirdupois in weight, with a muzzle energy of not less than 3,000 feet by pounds. Exploding projectiles are forbidden under the 1964 regulations, except where their use has been expressly authorized in advance by the proper officer of the appropriate area directorate. Authorization will only be granted where at least 2 of the following criteria obtained." And with all the other stuff on his mind, the book might as well have been written in Sanskrit for all the sense he could make of it. At least the boredom was reassuring. It was hard to be freaked out by anything so excruciatingly dull. A few things stuck in his mind, for instance. Under the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1979, as modified by the Supplementary Regulations Order 1981, it was legal to kill a vampire by driving a wooden stake through its heart between February 1st and November 22nd, unless you held a valid extermination licence issued by the Ministry of Agriculture, and a qualified veterinary surgeon had to be present to ensure that all procedures were carried out humanely and without causing undue suffering to the vampire. On the other hand, the owner or tenant of farmland was entitled to snare unicorns by means of virgins or other approved devices, providing that he could prove that they'd caused damage to growing crops or standing timber. 5:30 was running late that day. When the clock on the opposite wall eventually condescended to get there, Paul slammed the book shut. He'd have to finish it off at home, but there was a copy, Sophie's, remember her, at the flat, and practically sprinted for the front office. Not that he had any reason to get there before anybody in particular went home or anything, but he heard someone call his name and stopped. He recognised the voice, even though he hadn't exchanged more than a few words with Judy di Castelbianco since his interview. She spoke with what sounded to him like an American accent overlying something else he couldn't quite place. Back when Mr. Tanner had told him what the various partners in the firm actually did, he'd said that she looked after the entertainment sector. The letters after her name on the company letterhead apparently stood for Queen of the Fae, whatever the hell that meant. "Mr. Carpenter," she repeated, materialising out of her office like a Starfleet away team. "I was wondering, could you spare me a moment?" "Oh, well," Paul thought, and then, never mind, there'll be other days. "Sure," he said, trying to sound polite. She was looking at him. Her eyes, he noticed, were large and very light blue, almost silver. "You're not in a hurry or anything?" she said. No, not at all." Judy di Castelbianco was silent for a moment, studying him intensely, like a cat watching a mouse. "If you're concerned about getting out of the building after the door is locked, I do, of course, have a key." "Great," Paul said helplessly. Fine." Another second and a half of intense scrutiny, and then, "If you'd care to follow me," she said, and disappeared. For a moment, Paul was rooted to the spot, and then it occurred to him that she must have just walked round the corner, and he hadn't been paying attention. He followed, and there she was, opening the door of the small conference room. Today the room was L-shaped, its long side at right angles to the street. Judy di Castelbianco sat down at the head of the long, polished walnut table and nodded towards a chair on her left. As Paul sat down, it struck him that something was odd, but he wasn't quite sure what it was. "I'll get straight to the point," she said, steepling her unusually long fingers on the tabletop. "First, I should mention that it's not this firm's policy to interfere with any way with the personal lives of members of staff, nor is it my place as a partner to pass judgment on anything of that sort. However, I'm aware that my decision to assign Miss Pettingale temporarily to our Los Angeles office may be having repercussions on your—" she frowned slightly, "your relationship," she said, and she spoke the word as if it were an unfamiliar loan word from a foreign language, and she wasn't quite sure how it should be pronounced. Actually, Paul started to say, but apparently she couldn't hear him. She was looking past him, only just, a matter of 15 degrees or so. It was as if she couldn't actually see him, but had a fairly good idea of where he was likely to be. "Obviously," she went on, "if Miss Pettingale's assignment is causing any difficulties in your respective personal lives, I and we as a firm naturally regret that most sincerely. However," she hesitated, apparently unsure about something, "if I may speak frankly," she went on, "and please note that I'm making these observations in a purely unofficial capacity, I can't help but feel that this situation might actually be for the best, in that the relationship," the same slight stumble over the word, "in question was perhaps not entirely advisable, considering the interests of both parties. I don't claim any special insight in these matters, but you might care to consider the position in that light." Judy di Castelbianco stopped speaking and looked at him, as though they were in a play and she'd just given him his cue. Paul looked back at her and wondered what the hell he was supposed to say. He hadn't noticed before how extremely high and sharp her cheekbones were. Who were the Fae, anyhow? "It's all right, actually," he mumbled. "We just sort of, split up. I mean, it was her idea rather than mine, but I think we both knew we weren't, going anywhere. I mean, I'd sort of got the idea that maybe—" Mercifully, she interrupted before Paul could embarrass himself into a coma. "Fortuitous," she said. "It would appear, then, that the situation has worked out quite well. Presumably it'd be easier for you to adjust if you aren't faced with the prospect of working closely with Miss Pettingale while coming to terms with the cessation of the relationship." It took Paul a moment or so to translate that. Absolutely," he said. "I guess we both needed a bit of space," he added. That was what Sophie would have said. "So, like you were saying, you've done us both a bit of a favour, really?" "So," he he went on, though he knew that trying to make the awkward silences better by filling them with first words that come into your head is like dousing a fire with petrol. No hard feelings is about it, really. It's all just, perfectly fine. Indeed. Now she was looking off to his other side, just a tad. It's very fortunate that you feel that way. I trust I haven't offended you by raising the subject. Oh, no, Paul said quickly. Best to get it all out in the open, and very nice of you to care. I mean, be concerned. How old was she? The line of her mouth was so hard you would have engraved glass with her lips, but her skin was as smooth as a 16-year-old's. And was that it? Or... That's all. Judy di Castelbianco replied. Thank you for your time. If you care to follow me, I'll see that you leave the building without any problems. That made him wince, reminding him of the only time he'd been in the office after the front door was locked. That was, of course, the time he'd tried to rescue Sophie from the armed goblins who'd kidnapped her. Thanks, he mumbled, but she'd already left the room. As he'd feared, the goblins were already coming out to play. He'd seen them once or twice since that first traumatic encounter, but the sight of them still made him want to find the nearest sofa and hide behind it. It wasn't any one thing in particular. The red eyes, the pig-ape dog faces, the coarse brown and grey fur, the claws, more the overall effect of everything put together. But if goblins spooked Paul, it was nothing compared to the effect that Countess Judy seemed to have on goblins. They didn't seem to like her at all. As she rounded a corner with Paul in tow and walked into a small knot of them, busily playing toss the fire extinguisher, they spun round, shrieked and scampered away in all directions. A small rat-faced specimen they bumped into on the second-floor landing backed into a corner with its paws over its eyes, whimpering. Another jumped down a whole flight of stairs just to get out of her way, landing painfully on one knee and crawling off like a wounded crab. Either the Countess didn't notice, or she was so used to that sort of thing that it didn't occur to her to make any comment. But Paul couldn't help noticing that every time she came within 15 yards of a goblin, her skin actually seemed to glow with a very faint blue light, which clashed horribly with her lipstick. All in all, he was relieved when the front door closed behind him. In fact, he told himself, he could probably use a drink. For once, the pub on the corner wasn't too crowded, and he was able to sit down at a table in the corner. Plenty to think about. In fact, the trick would be not thinking about most of it. For example, what made the Countess think that she was under some kind of obligation to explain, or even to apologise? That didn't strike Paul as being J.W.W's style at all. Nobody had apologised or made excuses when he found out that he wasn't actually allowed to resign, on pain of being made to do horrible things to himself and others. Of course, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. If he still had the portable door, he could be in Hollywood, California, in the time it took to fish the door out of his cardboard tube and spread it on the wall. But Ricky Wormtoad had the door now, so that wasn't an option. Besides, there wouldn't be any point going, would there? It occurred to him to wonder whether Mr. Wormtoad had relieved him of the thing just in case he was tempted to go over there and make a nuisance of himself, hanging around in the front office while she laid out back. Unlikely, he decided. He felt sure that J.W.W. had more efficient ways of stopping him from being a pest. Pest control. Ugh. In the morning, he'd be reporting to Mr. Shumway, assuming he'd managed to get through the rest of the stuff he had to read without falling asleep. A few days ago, he'd have thought it was impossible to imagine a situation where he'd actually be pining for the Mortensen printouts or the long afternoons he'd spent staring at photographs of bleak Australian desert, scrying them for hidden bauxite deposits. Now, apparently, he was set on a course that would probably, at some stage, involve him in actual physical danger. After all, it stood to reason that if sorting out dragons and monsters and whatever called for the services of your Ricky Wormtoters and Benny Shumways, warlike men whose time came expensive, then inevitably those buggers must be dangerous. Teeth and claws and all manner of unpleasantness posing a severe risk to one's health. Paul wasn't sure he liked the idea of that, not one little bit. Up until then, telling J.W.W. where to stick their job and risking the full force of Mr. Tanner's warped imagination had been out of the question. But there was a substantial difference between being magically compelled to wander up and down Oxford Street wearing nothing but a coat of blue emulsion, announcing to all the world that you're a little flower fairy, and actual definitive death. Although Paul was probably more afraid of Mr. Tanner than of anyone else he'd ever met his entire life, he was fairly sure that Mr. Tanner wouldn't go so far as to kill him dead if he refused to carry on working for the old firm. A dragon, on the other hand, or a werewolf, or a gorgon, or a manticore, if it came to a contest between himself and a dangerous creature, with death as the prize for coming second, yet a feeling that the smart money would be on the fire-breathing, scale-armoured, razor-clawed professional killer, not on Mrs. Carpenter's little boy who came over all faint at the sight of needles. True, Benny Shumway was going to train him, but in his heart of hearts he felt that he probably wouldn't be quite enough. Groaning pallets stacked high with sow's ears aren't unloaded every morning at the gates of the silk purse factory. Paul frowned into the 2 millimeters of froth at the bottom of his glass. Officially, he no longer cared. He'd just lost the only girl he'd ever loved. Correction, the only girl out of the 100 or so he'd loved who'd ever loved him back, and accordingly his life was without meaning and worthless, and any dragon who relieved him of it would be doing him a favour. Officially, in his heart of hearts, however, Paul wasn't quite so sure about that. And besides, what if the dragon didn't kill him outright, but left him horribly chewed up and burned, blinded, imprisoned in a wheelchair, only to be able to communicate with the outside world by wriggling his ears in semaphore? Somehow he knew instinctively that he wouldn't like that at all. He turned the problem over in his mind as he dragged home on the bus. The answer came to him in a flash of pure white light while he was in the bath. It was blindingly obvious and brilliantly simple. Take, for example, a kamikaze pilot. First he has to do his basic training. This is how an aeroplane works. This is how to read a map. This is how you take off and land. This is how you make the aircraft go left or right, up or down. Months of classwork and one-to-one tuition later, he's ready. He's passed the written tests and the practicals, clocked up his 30 solo hours, attained the exacting standard required of a fighter pilot. He climbs into the cockpit and never comes back. Meanwhile, his slow-witted, cack-handed classmate, who flunked navigation and turned his flying instructor's hair prematurely grey by bouncing down the runway like a rubber ball, survives the war and goes on to found a National Electronics Corporation. Moral, it doesn't always pay to do your very best. With that comforting thought to snuggle up with, Paul fell asleep as soon as his briskly towelled head hit the pillow. He dreamed. He dreamed that he was back in the wilds of rural Gloucestershire, in the dark and the rain, and here are the strange children fixing his car. Here is Carrot Top handing him the bill, as Monica purrs contentedly on the floodlit forecourt. Here is Paul explaining that he didn't have that much cash on him, but... "Doesn't matter," says Carrot Top, looking up at him with round violet eyes. "On the house, least we could do, seeing as it's you." A moment while the penny drops. "Me?" Paul repeats, suddenly wary. "What about me?" Carrot Top smiles. "You're him," she says. "Oh," Paul says. "Am I?" "Course you are," interrupts another child, all golden hair and missing front teeth. "We knew it as soon as we saw you. You're Paul Carpenter, aren't you? Him, the chosen one." "Oink," Paul thinks. I'm not sure I quite... "Hang on a sec," says Carrot Top, and she darts back into the workshop, while all the other children, there's rather a lot of them apparently, come out of the shadows and stand around him, all staring at him as though he's the answer that's been inadvertently written up on the blackboard instead of the question. Then Carrot Top comes back, lugging along with her a huge calf-bound book, as big as the office procedures manual, if not bigger. "Here you go, look," says Carrot Top, and she thrusts a book at him, open somewhere near the middle. I don't actually," he starts to say, and there on the page, right under his nose, is a picture of a good-looking, clean-cut youth, and underneath it the words, "Paul Carpenter, the Chosen One." "Oh," he says, and then, feeling a right prawn for not knowing, "Chosen for what?" One of the other kids, a mop-headed brunette with glasses, clicks her tongue. "To lead your people to the chosen land, of course, silly. Here, look, it tells you all about yourself in the book, pages 256 to 312 inclusive." "Gosh," Paul says. "Can I have a look at that, please?" So they hand him the book, and it's written in normal English letters, and he can see his name repeated over and over again, but the rest of it's in French, or Italian, or possibly Spanish, and although he can make out about 1 word in 10, that's not enough to give him the sense of it, and just as he comes to a bit in Turkish, which apparently he can understand, They took the book away from him and closed it with a snap. "See," they say, "that's you, that is." Yes, he's forced to admit. That's me, but what about me? What am I supposed to... They're scowling at him. "You shouldn't make fun," they're saying. "That's rude." So Paul turns to Monica, who's still quietly idling away behind them, and he asks her what they're talking about, and she says it's obvious. It means you're the Gepreschneiner Freichenbot. Even a Dummkopf like you ought to know that. But he doesn't catch the rest of what she's saying because the kids are grabbing hold of him and lifting him up off the ground, carrying him on their shoulders round and round the courtyard, shouting, waving their arms, setting off the fire alarm, cheering like crazy. This is ridiculous. They couldn't be more pleased with him if he was Lawrence of Arabia and he just scored the winning goal in the World Cup final. But at the same time, they seem to know exactly who he is. So surely they ought to know he's just an immature waste of space who's just been dumped by the only girl... Paul opened his eyes. Not the fire bell, after all, just the persistent tweeping of his alarm clock. He'd always had the impression that it didn't think very much of him. This morning it sounded more than usually outspoken in its disapproval. "You some kind of messiah or something," it seemed to be saying. "Yeah, right, in your dreams." On Paul's desk was a memo. To PAC, from BS, Supplies. "Your first job for the department. We're running low on basic supplies. Check the enclosed stock book against the inventory and make our purchase requisitions for anything we need. BS. He read the note twice, just to be sure. Could be worse, he thought. If I can spin this out for long enough, maybe I won't have to die today. He opened the file that came with the memo. It was all pretty straightforward. 4 hours later, Paul had discovered they were almost out of sulphur candles, yellow 12-volt detonators, 50 caliber Browning machine gun ammunition and cyanide gas, and they could probably do with topping up on spare bear trap springs, chainsaw oil, 2-way radio battery charger packs, and slay more dragon pellets. He checked the unit prices in the suppliers list, remembering to deduct the 5% trade discount, and filled out 2 copies of the blue requisition forms on the yellow cashier's slip. It occurred to him that maybe heroism wasn't quite so hard after all. Lunchtime already, and not a drop of blood spilt or shed. Lunchtime. There hadn't been anybody on the reception desk when he'd arrived that morning, but he'd been on the doorstep at 9:01, so it was reasonable to assume that she'd gotten a little bit later than him, and he caught himself at it. Somehow, in the last 36 hours, she had stopped meaning Sophie and now meant Melts. Here we go again. One small step for a lemming, yet another giant leap for lemmingkind. Nevertheless, Paul jumped up, grabbed his coat, and raced for the front office like a Pamplona bull who hasn't realised it was that time already. He very nearly made it, but Benny Shumway suddenly stepped out in front of him and called, "Hey, you." Paul knew it was Mr. Shumway by his voice and by the thickness of his spectacle lenses, otherwise he'd have had trouble recognising him. His face was bright red, his beard had shrivelled down to charred wisps, and his suit was covered in white dust. His hands were red too, not quite red, more of a sort of terracotta brown. He didn't look at all well. "First aid kit," he said, "in my office. The side of the desk, second drawer down. I'll be in here," he added, and stepped back through the open door he'd appeared from. Paul vaguely remembered it was the closed file store. For some reason, he ran up the stairs instead of just walking. There was a white tin box on the second drawer on the left. Though it felt empty, he grabbed it and ran back. Paul had never been in the closed file store before, and under other circumstances he'd have found time to gawp. It was a huge room, so vast that it looked like it had mirrors on all 4 walls and the ceiling, and it was crammed with wooden shelves overflowing with identical, large, fat, buff manila envelopes. At the most conservative estimate, it had to be about the size of Westminster Abbey. Put it another way, many times larger than the whole of 70 St Mary Axe. But there wasn't time to think about that. Mr. Shumway was sitting on the floor, his back against a rack of shelves, his head slumped forward on his chest until Paul came in, whereupon he looked up and whispered, "Got it?" "Yes," Paul replied. "Look, are you—" "I'm fine," Mr. Shumway snapped. "Fetch that box over here." When the box was opened, there was nothing in it except some dried leaves, a tiny glass bottle with a few purple dregs at the bottom, and a small, thick, tatty book. It was the book that Mr. Shumway wanted. He seized it, flipped the index at the back, and turned forward till he found the page he wanted. He read a few words aloud, following the text with one stubby, brown stuff-caked finger. Then he dropped the book back into the box, leaned back and sighed. "Takes a while," he said wearily. "Thanks," he added. That's all right," Paul replied. "Look what happened. Should I call a doctor or an ambulance or something?" Mr. Shumway grinned. "No need," he said. "Let's see. I've got second-degree burns to most of my face. 3 cracked ribs. Been inhaling hot sulphur fumes and God knows what else. I've grazed all the skin off both knees. I think I've pulled a muscle in my left shoulder. The last thing I need is to be mauled about by one of the butchers you people call doctors. Besides, I'm a dwarf. We're impervious to x-rays. We've got rather more internal organs than you monkey derivatives, and we don't keep them in the same places. And our kidneys are soluble in aspirin. When we get messed up, we fix ourselves." He held up the tatty book. "Like this." Paul stared at the dog-eared cover. It looked just like an ordinary paperback, but the writing on it wasn't in any alphabet he'd ever come across. The nearest he could get to describing it was an extremely violent hand-to-hand battle drawn by L.S. Lowry. "Runes," Mr. Shumway explained. "It just says first aid manual. Bloody useful, though. Healing charms for all occasions." "Healing charms?" Paul repeated, his tone of voice translating that as snake oil. But then he noticed that Mr. Shumway's face wasn't looking nearly so scorched and raw, and his beard had grown back at least half an inch. "Bloody hell," he said. Mr. Shumway smiled and shook his head. "Before you ask," he said, "no, doesn't work on your lot. And even if it did, it's only good for a fairly limited range of injuries. Broken bones, burnt skin, stuff like that. We can cure colds, though," he added smugly. "And we've got stone teeth, so toothache isn't a major problem." Paul nodded. This was degenerating into weirdness, to which he'd carefully taught himself to turn a blind eye. But what happened?" he asked. "We in a fight or something?" "You could say that," Mr. Shumway muttered. Something was happening to him that apparently hurt. "No big deal, mind. Just a dragon." Just a dragon," Paul parroted. Mr. Shumway nodded. 12-year-old doe, 7.5 feet, about 300 pounds. Damn thing had got itself nicely dug in down the stacks of the V&A. Cunning little bitch, I'll give her that. Got hold of a sack of cement from somewhere and rolled in it, and then went and stood in a corner nice and still. It'd been there 6 months before they realised it wasn't just another statue. And then they only found out because it sneezed." He sighed. "I tried smoking it out, but they didn't like that. Reckoned it'd damage the paintings and stuff. Couldn't use explosives, obviously, or the .50 caliber. They wanted rid of it PDQ, so poison was out. And had to get rid of it manually, what Corporal Jones would have called the old cold steel." He stretched his back and winced. "I'm getting too old for all that," he sighed. "Course, young Ricky, he loves all that shit. He's not here, is he?" Mr. Shumway growled. "Off prancing around with this special project," he amended abruptly. "And you aren't fit to be out on your own yet, which just leaves me. Just as well I got this book, because I've got bank reconciliations to do this afternoon. I can't afford a week off flat on my back having skin grafts." Paul didn't say anything. He had no idea what colour he'd turned, white or green, but he hoped it wasn't too obvious. "Anyway," Mr. Shumway's beard was back to its usual length, and he was wriggling his shoulder to see if it was working properly again. "Thanks," he said. "Didn't feel like dragging up 3 flights of stairs. Where were you off to in such a hurry, anyhow?" Paul squirmed a little. Just lunch," he said. "Lunch?" Mr. Shumway grinned. "You mean you wanted to get down to reception before that new bird had a chance to get away? Quick off the mark, I'll give you that. But you'll just have to tie a knot in it for today. We've got training to do, remember?" "Training?" Paul said. Mr. Shumway nodded. "Which means," he said, "you missing lunch for a week or so, which is cruel and harsh, and a bloody fucking tragedy of epic proportions. But never mind, I'll be missing lunch too, and you won't see me crying my eyes out over it." Oh, that's fine," Paul said, bright and brittle. "It doesn't bother me. Thanks for giving up your lunch hour. It's..." don't crawl," said Mr. Shumway. "If the good Lord had intended us to crawl, he'd given us 100 legs and an exoskeleton." He stood up. Apart from the white dust on his clothes and the "let's not kid ourselves" bloodstains on his hands, he looked perfectly normal. "My office," he said, putting the tatty book back in the box. 5 minutes. You have, of course, read all the stuff I told you to read?" "What? Oh, sure." "Very sensible." Mr. Shumway grinned at him. "Because if you hadn't, it would have been unpleasant, I'm telling you. That old survival instinct will pull you through every time."